This is part 3 of the weekly recap, 11/27 to 12/01. I am going to talk about Nathan Lambert. He's talked about reinforcement learning with human feedback. There's a lot more depth to this than just technical talk or anything like that. Nathan is a really deep thinker, very much appreciated. I would say he's in the league of Sergey Levin. He's not a professor, but he has that same depth that I really like. Andrew Saxe, same thing, incredibly impressive. The question here is, what are deep neural networks actually for? Why do we have depth? Why do we need deep layers? His PhD was with Andrew Ng and others thinking about those types of things, and now he's applying that knowledge to the sort of study of digital intelligence versus biological intelligence, and trying to see differences and similarities, which I think is pretty interesting. Tris Warkentin, he's with Google DeepMind. He was at a AI for Operations conference. I would say that the conference was relatively weak. Whenever you go to the business school, everything becomes pretty shallow. Not that it's not important, okay? These things are important. I mean, I am an MBA myself, so I know how important business school is. The problem with business school is there is often nothing tangible, really. It's a lot of gibberish, but then all of the above can be summarized into what's called running a business. So there's just no right way to do this more efficiently, I would say. So we have to talk a lot. We have to spend a lot of time, thinking about maybe not so tangible, important things, and then every now and then we come across something really important. My personal favorite in actually Tris's talk was more a question of what is intelligence in the first place, and how should we classify intelligence, and what does it mean for business? And it has to do with liability. It has to do also, it's actually tangibly related to my talk that I spoke about with Carlotta Pavone. This is the Not Even On podcast. It's December 4th, 2023. This is Krimdelko. For the year, we are up 106%. The market's up 19%. We're outperforming by 87%. The market's still open. These things could be changing. So Nathan Lambert is an expert on reinforcement learning with human feedback. The problem with reinforcement learning with human feedback is that what if you don't understand the reward function? So you want to move a model into certain behavior, but you don't quite know how to channel the rewards, right? In reinforcement learning, you have reward functions, and those reward functions guide the system towards a desired behavior. Now, what if you don't know that reward function? For example, a typical example would be if you have to decide whether a joke is funny or not, and you want to steer the model towards being more funny. That's relatively difficult to model, and therefore maybe what you could do is have human labelers decide, okay, well, this is more funny than this, and this is more funny than that, and that way the system kind of moves towards a more funny outcome when you prompted something. So this is the fundamental idea that Nathan is presenting. I think Nathan, like I said in the prelude, he has that depth that I really like. So he goes back to the idea of what are human preferences? Do humans even have preferences? He goes back to von Neumann and Morgenstern, and then talks a lot about, not specifically about economics, but this is of course a topic very dear to my heart, because I've been working on this during my undergrad, during a lot of my MBA, and then later on on Wall Street. I've been dealing with human preferences one way or the other, but I would say most interesting was the Professor Fair's class at undergrad. He's an experimental economist, so he talks a lot about, okay, in experimental economics, what you do is you really try to model preferences. You try to model behavior. You try to find relationships between preferences and behavior. You try to find maybe even reward functions. It wasn't called like that. It wasn't called RLHF or anything like that, but it's really the same application. So what you do is you try to see how people behave. You try to then infer reward models from the behavior, or You try to experiment with reward functions and then see how the behavior works. So all of these things are, in my opinion, very highly related, and Nathan actually acknowledges that. So he talks about that. In my idea that I took away from his talk is there's two things that I think would be very interesting, which is one is gamification of classification, and the other is financial incentives. What I mean with that is, instead of having human labelers labeling joke A is more funny than joke B, how about we have them predict in a contest of, let's say, 100 labelers which joke will win. So we have prediction markets. You could either gamify it by giving people points, or you could actually financialize it by giving people money. Last thing I want to mention in Nathan's presentation was a closed form solution, which again is very interesting philosophically. A closed form solution means just, okay, look, every situation has an optimum that could be reached through a closed form solution. So some sort of mathematical formula that leads towards an optimal outcome. And what that reminds me of is Pareto efficiency, Nash equilibrium. Okay, so all these concepts that have been swirling around economics for decades are now coming back in reinforcement learning. Pareto efficiency, something along the lines of, well, we can't make anybody better off without making somebody worse off, that kind of thing. I am a big fan of these things, and I think it could go into the conversation. Okay, now I'm going a bit on a tangent, but if we have some of the big questions in AI, such as what is fairness, what is intelligence, I think they all could be actually solved pretty neatly with analytical answers that are relying on Pareto efficiency, on Kant, on Nash, John Nash, because we could have, let's say, a definition of fairness, which is sort of John Rawlsian. We can say a system that can make somebody better off without hurting anybody else is unfair, so therefore we should change that. Or we could have a definition of intelligence, which is if an actor can do an act which makes somebody else than themselves better off while not hurting anybody else, that is intelligence. Something along those lines could be used as a definition. But again, this is a tangent. So I think Nathan, again, very interesting on that front as far as depth, and also really interesting comments about how these models work and about how they're being deployed. Next, Andrew Saxe. Andrew Saxe is with University College London, and I think his presentation was very, very impressive to me because I'll give the punchline first. So he did a PhD with Andrew Ng. And in that PhD, he sort of anticipated the ability to pre-train models. He anticipated transformers, and he anticipated fine-tuning. And where he came from in his dissertation was the idea, okay, why do we have depth in a neural net? What's the purpose of depth? And does depth cost me something? Not just computational power, by the way, that's of course obvious, but maybe it costs me also in a sense that if I have depth, if I had a linear one-layer model, okay, I have an input, I have a transformation and an output, I know what I'm doing. And if I don't have that, so if I'm sort of exposed to more layers in the network, I kind of lose sight of what's going on. And it's not just about me from an outside observer perspective. It's also the model itself could get confused and get stuck in a local minima, which could potentially be a problem. So he's tackling these problems. And what I found really fascinating is to see that he writes a PhD, I think, in the sort of early teens of 2000, and anticipates self-attention, anticipates all of it. He doesn't call it like that, but he anticipates. Now, the fundamental answer to the question, why do we have layers in the first place, is that we can classify simple things first and then build from that. That's sort of the fundamental idea. Now, Saxe actually, his work now is sort of at the crossroads between digital intelligence and biological intelligence. So he's trying to understand neural nets in mammal brains, and then look at neural nets that we have in digital brains, and go back and forth. He showed a really interesting experiment with rats, which I thought was unbelievably interesting. So he sets up an experiment where rats are supposed to predict. So they're shown something on a screen. If the something is on the left side, they're supposed to turn a wheel on the left side. If it's on the right side, they're supposed to turn right, and so on and so forth. And they get rewarded if they're right, and if they're wrong, they get nothing. So what's first most striking is that after a while, the rats actually learn. They are able to learn. There's an accuracy of over 75%. So they really learn. It's not random. That's, to me, already pretty impressive. And then what's really interesting is he shows that there are biases. So he shows that there are rats that are biased towards doing, let's say, always turning to the left. Other rats always turning to the right. Then he is able to visualize the neural architecture of these rats and finds that there are inductive biases starting with the input and then starting sort of with the neural architecture. Now, this is a little bit beyond my sort of pay grade in terms of the actual dynamics here, but the way I understand it is there's a pretty quick sort of dynamic in the model that the model sort of says, look, I'm pretty complex. Let me get a feel for the data, the input that's coming, and then at inference time, I will sort of converge towards a solution. So rat number one figures out, if I turn right, I tend to win. So how about I just keep turning right for a while and see what happens? Another rat realizes early on that it's pretty random, so the rat keeps doing random moves, and so on and so forth. Like after, of course, this is important. Okay, this is in the beginning. You know, as we know in reinforcement learning, particularly if we start with with zero inductive bias, we have to start somehow, and usually random is actually a pretty good start. And then we keep going. So what he's saying is that it's kind of like those deep layers are creating their own inductive bias, and maybe we can do better by starting with an inductive bias, which helps the model move towards the right solution in the first place. I think that's where, within his PhD, he then came up with the pre-trained / fine-tuning model, because he figured, look, how about we train a model, a deep network, in a very complex computational setting to have a basic knowledge base, and then we fine-tune, because what fine-tuning really means is we reduce the action space. So to me, that's really fascinating how he came through a theoretical door into what's really practically being applied today. It also shows me that the community really isn't, this is not random. This is not like random researchers come up with stuff and then every now and then something hits. I mean, this has been building on these transformers and the self-attention paper and the Instruct GPT paper and OpenAI and Llama and all these models. They're all built on shoulders of giants. I think we should be reminding ourselves that is the case, that these people don't just come up with genius solutions. As creative as they are, I just want to be clear about the importance of Saxe's presentation when it comes to understanding the architecture of these models. This reminds me of the presentation I had recently in the neuroscience department. By the way, Saxe was also in the neuroscience department, so this is neuroscience / digital science, and I think that's another very interesting avenue of research that I'm seeing more and more, which is sort of the crossroads between what neurology and neuroscience and computer science see, because they're kind of building on the same ideas. This is similar to aerospace engineering in the early days. I'm sure was very much influenced by biology until it wasn't anymore. And I think similarly here, in fact, if you think about the transformer architecture per se, it doesn't rely on recursion anymore, so it doesn't do the forward-backward stuff anymore. So it's a little bit different than the human analogous in the brain. And this leads me to the third presentation, Tris Warkentin. He's with Google DeepMind, and his presentation was within the context of an AI/operations conference at the GSP. A little bit more shallow in that sense, but doesn't matter. I think Tris is still very interesting person. I mean, he was instrumental in developing BARD. He was around when the self-attention paper was written, and well, he wasn't part of the paper, but I mean, he's been there, he's seen from the inside how AI research is really pushed forward also in practice at Google. And I think, the conversation there, also he was later on a panel with a gentleman from Uber and a gentleman from a company called Robust AI that he founded. So they were talking about security, they talking about risks, kind of that general stuff that you see that you would read in a Financial Times or Economist article. Now, what's really interesting about Tris's presentation, in my opinion, is more sort of the fundamental question: what is actually intelligence, and how does it sort of filter through into the workflows of the real world? And I think if we want to understand how AI and intelligence affects the real world, we have to have a little bit of an understanding of what intelligence is, so we know what we're talking about. And there's a very useful paper by DeepMind that just came out about that. So they're classifying intelligence, sort of a little bit like the self-driving space with level 1, 2, 3. You can argue about this, it's not good, it's this and that, doesn't matter. I think it's good to have a classification so we can even talk about it, right? So we have very narrow skills, we have a little bit broader skills, then we have very high-level skills, such as playing Go and chess, but then they're relatively narrow in a sense that high-level narrow and then high-level general, which would be probably sort of the recent language models. We have the question of adaptability and learning and flexibility. We have the Robinson-Crusoe problem. So those are all things. I don't want to get entangled too much into the conversation about now which level of intelligence, because again, we're sort of in the early days there. What I want to say is that it's useful to have that conversation. This was exactly my talk with my conversation with Carlotta Pavone. This has been occupying me also personally for curiosity. I think as an investor in robotics, I think we have to think about this from a liability perspective in two ways. One is, if robots are intelligent, then they have, in my opinion, they will also get responsibility and rights. And then they also indemnify the vendor, right? It's a little bit like the parent that lets the kid out in the wild. I mean, at some point you're not liable anymore for what your child does. At some point you are, and then at some point you're not. And the same here. So I think we're going into that world, and I think it's useful to think about that. I think the other thing which is useful is, again, if we look at it from a sort of business perspective, okay, which level of intelligence do we want to use? But I think about a boardroom conversation, which, okay, what is our intelligence budget today? Like, what do we do? And then the answer could be, well, we have narrow intelligence that can, fraud detection, credit card. Okay, that's narrow intelligence. It's not very sophisticated, but it's all right. Well, we have narrow, highly sophisticated, maybe a much better way to detect fraud. Maybe we have broader, high-level intelligence. We use LLMs for customer service. And all of these things, they have different, profit centers, they have different, budgets. So it's useful to start thinking about these processes. I think, to me, that is, it's a whole new field, actually, to think about it. It's a whole new field of management science, of thinking about, how that, accounting. I mean, that's another big one, right? How do you even account for, how does Dojo get into the Tesla balance sheet, if at all? And it's going to get in the balance sheet, but in the profit and loss calculation. For now, how do you account for potential of general AI? What is general AI? A lot of interesting questions. Now, I want to say one more thing here, which could be used as an amendment to the Carlotta Pavone conversation, but I want to say it here. I feel like the idea of intelligence can be tackled sort of in a Kantian way, right? So what is intelligence? If I can make somebody better off, or if I can increase the action space of at least one entity, which is not me, without hurting anybody else, that is intelligence. To me, that would be a good starting position to define intelligence. Lastly, I want to mention Tinglong Dai's presentation. He's from Johns Hopkins. He's an operations management person, and he was talking about how they incorporate AI into workflows in healthcare. And I thought it was, I wasn't too impressed with the presentation, because the 800-pound gorilla in healthcare to me is always adoption, corruption. There's a lack of transparency. We don't know who pays. We don't know who's the customer. So those are the problems. So to talk about productivity gains through AI in a sector that suffers Aaron's law, I think is a little bit almost hypocritical. I asked him that. He was defensive. But nevertheless, I think he said one really interesting thing to me, which was that AI could change the liability situation in a sense that right now, people are using AI as liability as a pretext not to apply AI, and that could change. And to me, that's an interesting thought that could also happen in self-driving cars, where at some point selling a car without an advanced full self-drive suite could be actually more expensive, and you could be prone to liability versus if you have an advanced safety suite like Tesla. So to summarize part 3 of my weekly presentation, the four presentations that I spoke about, really, really important stuff. Nathan Lambert, RLHF, and really an in-depth conversation about what are preferences, how do we capture preferences, how do we train models that we don't know reward functions really well, what is reward function design actually. Andrew Saxe, very on a similar page here, but his thought goes more deeper and theoretical, and why do we even have layers in networks? What's the purpose of a deep network and the deep layers? And the answer being that we can start with simple concepts and then build up. Question there, of course, is reward function design, very similar to Lambert's presentation. Trace Warkentin, I think fundamental idea there is, okay, what is intelligence, and how do we classify intelligence when it goes into, we need to have a classification for what we're talking about when we want to apply it in management and accounting. And lastly, the gentleman from Johns Hopkins, who spoke about the adoption of AI in healthcare, which I think the most interesting takeaway from there for me was that we could have a change in the liability equation, where liability actually becomes a driver of AI. Thank you.